You know what you have to do if you want to pass. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Rose clutched her test paper tightly, the red, 45%, circled at the top burning into her vision. Her fingers trembled as she sat frozen in her seat. Across the room, Dr. Benson leaned casually against his desk, watching her. His smirk was cruel, a quiet reminder that he held all the power. It wasn't just the failing grade that crushed her, it was the weight of everything it represented. This was her third failure in his class, despite sacrificing sleep and putting every ounce of effort into her studies. She had spent nights in the dim light of her hostel room, her medical textbook spread across her lap, going over every detail. None of it mattered. Dr. Benson straightened his posture, his arms crossed as he spoke again. Rose, don't waste my time. You know what needs to happen. Her stomach twisted as she fought to keep her expression blank. His meaning wasn't new, but the way he said it now felt like a final warning. She bit down on her lower lip to stop it from trembling. I'm here to learn, not, her voice cracked, betraying her fear. He raised an eyebrow, cutting her off with a raised hand. Then you continue failing, he said bluntly, his words sharp and deliberate. Think about it. He turned, walking toward the door as if the conversation was over. But it wasn't over, not for her. As Dr. Benson left the classroom, Rose felt the walls closing in. Her chest felt heavy as shame and helplessness gripped her. She wanted to cry, scream, and fight back, but the weight of her parents' sacrifices silenced her. They had given up everything for her education, and failing again wasn't an option. But giving in, that thought felt worse than failure. Later that evening, Rose sat in her tiny hostel room, her textbooks piled high on the bed around her. The air was heavy, and her chest felt tight as she tried to recount the day's events to her best friend, Mariatu. Her voice cracked as she described Dr. Benson's smirk, the unspoken threat behind his words. Mariatu listened, her face growing darker with every word. He's a monster, she said finally, her fist clenched. You can't let him ruin your life like this. What choice do I have? Rose whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. If I fail again, my parents will be devastated. I'll lose everything. Mariatu moved closer, wrapping her arms around Rose in a tight hug. You won't lose everything, she said softly. We'll find another way. But even as she said the words, her eyes betrayed her doubt. Dr. Benson didn't let up. The following week, he summoned Rose to his office. The small space felt suffocating as she stood awkwardly near the door, clutching her notebook like a shield. You're barely passing, he began, leaning back in his chair with a casual arrogance. But there's a way to fix that. His smile widened, but there was nothing kind about it. Rose felt her chest tighten. Please, sir, she said, her voice trembling. I just want to pass on my own merit. Dr. Benson's expression darkened as he leaned forward, his tone turning cold. Then you'll fail, he said bluntly. And I'll make sure no other lecturer will help you. His words cut deep, and Rose's knees felt weak. She left his office in tears, her mind spinning. She didn't know how much longer she could resist. When Mariatu found Rose crying in their room that evening, her heart broke. Maybe you should give in, she said hesitantly, her voice soft. Rose's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with anger. "I can't," she said fiercely. I can't." Marietta sighed, sitting beside her. "Then we'll fight him," she said. But even as she said the words, they both knew how powerful Dr. Benson was. The final blow came when Dr. Benson accused Rose of plagiarism on a critical test. She had worked tirelessly on her answers, but his accusation was final. "You can't win against him," Marietta said grimly as she comforted Rose that night. "He's too powerful." Rose stared at the wall, the weight of her family's sacrifices crushing her. That night, she made the choice that would haunt her for years. The next evening, Dr. Benson cornered Rose after class. His voice was cold as he gave her an ultimatum. "It's your choice," he said simply. Rose felt her stomach twist. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she replied, "Fine. You win." Dr. Benson's smirk was triumphant, as if he had always known she would break. As Rose followed him to his office, she felt a deep, crushing shame. Every step felt like a betrayal of herself, her dreams, and her family. She knew she would never forgive herself for what she was about to do. Afterward, Rose sat alone in her hostel room, staring at the walls. She felt hollow, like a part of her had been stripped away. Dr. Benson had kept his word, her grades improved, and he left her alone, but the cost had been unbearable. Marietta tried to comfort her, but Rose pulled away. "You don't understand," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. And maybe Marietta never could. Weeks turned into months, and life moved on, but Rose remained stuck in that moment. The weight of her decision followed her like a shadow. Each time she looked at her test scores, now perfect, she felt disgusted. She had earned them, but not the way she wanted. The guilt gnawed at her, a constant reminder of the price she paid. Her parents called often, their voices full of pride. "We knew you could do it, Rose," her mother would say cheerfully. "All the hard work is finally paying off." Rose's voice would tremble as she replied, "Yes, Mama. Thank you." She wanted to scream, to tell them the truth, but how could she? They had given up so much for her. Telling them would shatter everything they believed about her. Marietta noticed the change in Rose. Her once lively friend was now withdrawn, moving like a ghost through her own life. "Rose," she said one evening, sitting beside her on the bed, "you can't let this eat you alive." Rose shook her head. "I don't know how to stop it, Marietta. It's like, it's always there, waiting to remind me." Her voice broke, and Marietta hugged her tightly. "You survived, Rose. That's what matters." But even as Marietta spoke, she knew the words weren't enough. Years passed, and Rose graduated at the top of her class. She wore her cap and gown with a forced smile, accepting her degree while cameras flashed. The applause was deafening, and her parents wept tears of joy. To everyone else, she was a success story. But deep down, she felt like a fraud. Rose began working at a busy hospital, quickly earning respect for her dedication and skill. She worked long hours, barely taking breaks, as if staying busy could silence the memories. Patients praised her, colleagues admired her, but the guilt lingered. "I don't deserve this," she would whisper to herself in the quiet of her office. Her husband, Ibrahim, noticed her sleepless nights. Rose, you work harder than anyone I know. Why can't you let yourself rest? He asked gently one evening. Rose stared out the window, unable to meet his eyes. I'm just trying to make up for lost time, she said softly. Ibrahim frowned but didn't push. One morning, as Rose prepared for her shift, her phone rang. Dr. Rose, we need you urgently, a nurse said breathlessly. The patient's critical, and you're the only surgeon available. Rose rushed to the hospital, her mind focused on the task ahead. But as she entered the operating room, she froze. Lying on the table, pale and frail, was Dr. Benson. Time seemed to stop as their eyes met. His face was older now, his hair thin and white, but the smug arrogance she remembered still lingered. You, he rasped weakly, his voice barely audible. You have to save me. Rose felt her heart pound in her chest. The memories came rushing back, his smirk, his threats, her tears. This was the man who had destroyed a part of her life. And now, his life was in her hands. For a long moment, she couldn't move. She wanted to walk away, to let him suffer, but her oath echoed in her mind. I'll do my best, she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. She turned to her team, giving orders as they prepared for surgery. Her hands were steady as she scrubbed in, but her mind raced. Could she really see him? Did he deserve to live? Before the surgery began, Rose asked to speak to him privately. She stood beside his bed as he struggled to focus on her face. Do you remember me? She asked quietly. His eyes darted away, unable to hold her gaze. That was a long time ago, he muttered. Rose's voice trembled with emotion. I begged you to see me as your daughter, she said. I asked you to think about my family, my dreams. But you ruined me. Her throat tightened as tears welled in her eyes. Now you expect me to save you. Dr. Benson remained silent, his face turning away in shame. Rose wiped her tears and took a deep breath. I'll save you, she said firmly. Not for your sake, but for mine. I won't let you turn me into someone like you. The surgery was long and complicated, requiring focus and precision. Every movement of Rose's hands was steady, even as her mind flickered with memories of the past. This wasn't about Dr. Benson anymore. It was about her, about proving to herself that she was better than the pain he had caused. When the surgery was over, the team let out a collective sigh of relief. He's stable, Rose announced, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. She stepped back, removing her gloves as she looked at the man she had once feared. The next day, Rose visited Dr. Benson in recovery. He looked small and weak, nothing like the powerful man she once knew. You're alive, she said quietly. He turned his head toward her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, regret, shame, or both. Thank you, he muttered weakly, his voice barely a whisper. Rose stared at him for a long moment. I saved your life, she said, her voice steady. Not because you deserved it, but because I couldn't let myself become like you. She turned and walked away, leaving him in silence. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Benson requested to see Rose again. She hesitated, unsure of what more he could possibly say, but eventually, she agreed. When she entered his room, he looked frail, his hands trembling as he tried to sit up. I owe you an apology, he began, his voice hoarse. I've carried the weight of what I did to you, and to others, for years. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know I'm sorry. Rose folded her arms, her expression guarded. Saying sorry doesn't fix what you did, she said sharply. Dr. Benson nodded slowly, his face etched with regret. I know. But I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to make it right. He looked at her, his eyes sincere. Help me build something that will protect students from people like me. At first, Rose couldn't believe him. But as weeks passed, Dr. Benson's health began to improve, and he drafted plans for a program to protect students from exploitation. He shared them with Rose, asking for her input. It won't erase the past, he said one day, but maybe it will help the future. Reluctantly, Rose agreed to help. Together, they refined the program, anonymous reporting systems, accountability policies, and ethics training for staff. Rose wasn't sure she could forgive him, but seeing real change take root gave her a sense of purpose. Months later, the university announced the program. Students came forward with their stories, and staff began to undergo mandatory training. At the launch ceremony, Rose stood at the podium, speaking to a room full of students and faculty. I was once a student here, she began. I know what it's like to feel powerless and afraid. But no one should ever feel that way again. Today, we begin a new chapter, a chapter of accountability and change. As the crowd erupted in applause, Rose felt something inside her shift. The scars of her past would always remain, but they no longer controlled her. She had turned her pain into something meaningful, something that could help others. That evening, as Rose walked through the campus with Marietta by her side, she stopped in front of an old tree by the library. She pulled a small seedling from her bag and planted it carefully in the soil. What's this for? Marietta asked, smiling. A reminder, Rose said softly. That growth is possible, even when the roots are deep in darkness. As they walked away, the weight on Rose's shoulders felt lighter. Healing, she knew, wasn't a straight path. But she had begun. And for the first time in years, she felt peace.